But yeah, treatment. The one thing that I've sort of hinted at this already, I think is really important is there are some people that have this totally overwhelmed by it, in a really chronic state, really struggling with it. And if you try and get them to do ERP on this quickly, my experience is it makes things worse. And I've had many clients that have had clinicians, even even well-known clinicians that have got them to sort of do ERP to this sort of stuff very quickly, and it's just made everything worse because they're doing more compulsions. It's caused more threat monitoring, more resentment and struggle, more worry. So for this group of people, and they might be struggling to function as well, they might be very depressed, I think we need to start off with the drop-in anchor for overwhelm and really focus on behavior, like behavioral activation type ideas, obviously with a values-based emphasis and compassion-based emphasis. So that would look like, you go on my YouTube or on my folder of resources if you don't know drop-in anchor for overwhelm, but you just very briefly notice what's going on. You don't really focus in on it. You just, depersonalization. And you spend a lot more time getting into the body, 2, 5 minutes, 10 minutes even, just getting into the body. You have to be careful with this because people will read online about grounding and it will sound like you can sort of ground this away. And I don't think you can do that. Personally, I couldn't do that. But it's more like you're getting a sense of like, I'm in my body, I'm in control of my actions, I can focus on things other than the DPDR. So it's like the body is used as an anchor to support us rather than sort of ground it away or, bring us into a window of tolerance that, actually trying to do that will just make everything more intense. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you're really focusing on behavior. So you're getting them to plan out the whole day, half an hour chunks, 1 hour chunks, whatever, or setting some goals, to-do list. And people are really trying to use timers and stay on task and follow the plan, not the mood. And I think until someone can do that really well and cope with what's going on at baseline a bit better, you don't want to go near ERP unless they have a high tolerance. Actually, people could be in quite intense symptoms, but they won't be overwhelmed then, but they could be in quite high intensity symptoms, but there's more tolerance. Then you could move a bit quicker. But for these people that really don't want to go near it, and they will drop out of therapy if they're made to do if they're coerced to do exposure. So you really want to take it slow and build up that. And then the engage part, you want to be careful of this because a lot of people, if they have derealization and they engage, they'll just be aware of how unreal everything looks. So you have to have acceptance and engagement really together. So as I look out and the world looks weird, I have to be trying to accept that and gently engage with stuff anyway. And often it's better to have a more active engagement, a little bit like DBT distraction, but we are trying to up the acceptance as well. It's not literal distraction, but you could have people, like I'll do drop-in anchor, and in the engage phase, we'll watch a video about their interests. I had someone that was really into animations, like spin-off animations from Star Wars, which were really cool. They were really interesting, and we would watch them as the engage. I'd put them on screen and he would practice engaging in that content. So it's more a focus on story and narrative, and that was much more helpful for him. You might engage people interpersonally more. You might talk to them and hear about their hobbies or their interests or things like that. You might do something physical in the room, in the space. You might get them doing some kind of physical task that they can, or reading a book. So you can do more active engagement. Again, which we're trying to not frame it as distraction because acceptance there. It's a little like distraction, but we're really trying to bias that acceptance muscle being there. What else would I say? Trauma work, if it's relevant. I tend to delay that with people like this because I think there's no point doing the trauma until there's the stability in these skills. I think you'll all know that well. And that's why in things like prolonged exposure for PTSD, there's now a growing movement of people doing DBT before you do the prolonged exposure, or doing the ACT skills or CFT skills before you do the exposure work, so that people are not just overwhelmed and the symptoms are made worse. And people like John Hirschfield are a good example. Working at Shepherd Pratt, seeing people in really tough place with OCD, and I'm sure he'll see clients with DPDR. That's why he's bringing in DBT. Is for these types of issues when people dissociate during ERP. And we've got ACT that I think ACT and DBT are very similar and related. It's just obviously ACT has some slightly different assumptions, underpinning assumptions around acceptance and values and things, but there's a lot of overlap between them, in all honesty. Self-compassion, doing a lot of that. If they've got more tolerance of the symptoms, then you can build up the skills, the normal sequence we would do: dropping anchor, urge surfing, dipping in and out the stream, self-compassion, values-based ERP. You sort of move through that typical protocol. Then you're doing more situational ERP, like going out in nature, socializing, talking even when you feel like this, sports, exercise, work, whatever has been the trigger. And you could probably start the trauma work in parallel with this sort of level. And then a high degree of tolerance you do. I've had people that have either had therapy before and are doing reasonably well, but it's still there, or they just like naturally very tolerant of it, like quite a degree of acceptance. Well, then you can move more into this stuff. So you could do the actual interoceptive exposures. You get people to stare at their reflection or move in ways that sort of trigger it, or look at nature, or whatever the things. There are some YouTube simulations of these sorts of things, and TV shows like Black Mirror and the documentaries about existential things. All of that can kind of be used more directly. And some people, you might start at one and kind of build up. Other people, never get past one, and that's okay. They can still get improvement. A lot of people might be 1 and 2. If they're still struggling, or they have this high degree of acceptance, they want to really deepen that, then using the stuff from 3. CBT for this, a lot of the message boards and things I'm on, people will go very quickly to this interoceptive stuff. I don't think that is always the right choice, to be honest. You can do ERP to the core fears with this sort of group, trauma work in parallel again. This, I've got a slide about some adaptations for the different tools or ideas. So I talked about the drop-in anchor for overwhelm, having acceptance and engagement together, acceptance of the feelings. You might work on the numbness and looking below the numbness, seeing what's there. Russ Harris has done a lot about when you're working with numbness, you can ask yourself, is there anything below this? Sometimes you do find there are emotions below it. And then sometimes people do need to grieve and have other emotions come out, and it can even improve the symptoms. So an interesting one. Not always, it's not always that simple, but sometimes that can help. You've got a lot of judgment about it. It's unbearable. I don't like this. I don't want this. We've got to be diffusing that. Urge surfing, the maladaptive coping mechanisms. Dipping in and out the stream, you can do it with that rumination about it, or you can do it with the threat monitoring of it. When the tolerance is higher, you wouldn't do that too early, I think, with most people. ERP, we've said, sometimes if it's triggered in ERP, if they have a high degree of acceptance, you can continue with ERP. But a lot of people, they won't have it sort of kick in, and it will sort of interrupt what's going on in the ERP, and in which case I then switch more to the overwhelm skills and interpersonally doing drop-in anchor and sort of grounding them, bringing them back into the room, not to get rid of it completely, but to get some degree of connection, some degree of getting out of the depersonalization or the intense level of it. So you can ground people in the sense you can bring it down a few notches. You just can't ground it away, I would say. Situational stuff's very important. Trauma, if it's relevant. Self-compassion, people will feel numb, so they don't feel any compassion, but that's a barrier for a lot of people. So you've just got to make sure they know it's not a feeling. It's a motivation. It's a commitment. It's an action. Self-taught behaviors, working with the resistance to it. Using this socially, because people are so hard on themselves, like, I can't connect because of this. Okay, lots of self-compassion in the social domain of their life. Yeah, ACT talks about this window of flexible responding rather than a window of tolerance, because a window of tolerance makes you think, you have a lot more control than you do. And actually, if you listen to Dan Siegel's original formulation of window of tolerance, he never described it as like, I can regulate into this window. He's a lot more ACT consistent actually in what he says. But the window of flexible responding is like, we don't want to be pushing people into something where they can't control their attention. They're not in control of their actions so much. They're not in control of their active thinking. So if someone's like that, that's where you want to do the overwhelm skills more. But if they have a wide window of flexible responding, you can feel depersonalized and you can continue to do values-based stuff. I do that. I mean, it still comes up for me at times, and I can be very depersonalized and still talk and still be focused with people and have high degree of acceptance of it. So it really depends where their window of flexibility is with it, where they can, and sometimes you have to do more the coping skills if their window of flexible responding is very narrow. Window of tolerance, it makes you think, oh, I do the right regulation stuff, I can move out of DPDR. But of course, that will feed it because I'll be like, oh, this grounding technique's not working. Why is it not working? Oh God, I'm even worse, and that's what happened to me. I did a lot of trauma therapy and sensory motor and EMDR and all that sort of stuff when I was in this. And none of it was helpful at all. And it all made me go like, it's not working. I'm getting work. Why is this not happening? Whereas as soon as I switched it, and you might do similar techniques, but when you do them with an acceptance agenda, suddenly it was a lot more helpful for me. Um, so yeah, the trauma pass may be very relevant in some people. Well-being is helpful if you can get people with a really nice, healthy lifestyle. It will take the edge off things a little bit, if they're exercising. I mean, endorphins, there was a bit of research at one point that showed serotonin and things were quite helpful with this, and some of the endorphins could actually take the edge off it a little bit. And they were looking into drug treatments for that. Um, uh, what else was I going to say there? So yeah, try and get those healthy lifestyles in place. Um, the social performance part is a big part of it where people get tangled up. Um, Interpersonal, sometimes you find clients like this are very avoidant and they're hard to connect with. So you might be doing a lot of relational work and looking at how their relationships are going in their life, and are they detached, and is it hard for them to connect, and what are the behaviors that would bring them closer to people, and what are the things that are disconnected. And you might find these people just aren't sharing anything about themselves because they're really in this place and they're not expressing any vulnerability. Might not be telling anyone they're going through it, and they're the clinically relevant behavior ones that are disconnecting people. And you might say, well, let's find someone you can be vulnerable and share this with, or let's think about how do you share your thoughts, feelings, and needs a bit more. And you sometimes find that interpersonal connection can improve it as well if people work on it. So yeah, that's everything. These are I really like this book, the Fugan Nezaroglu's book, because it's very ACT based. So that's probably the book that's most aligned with what we do. And she's a big ERP CBT therapist. She was at IOCDF. We saw her presenting. She's great. And in that they have like how to do core fear exposure and lots of ACT ideas. So it's pretty good. This one, Elaine Hunter's, is more. It has more of the cognitive reappraisal type stuff that we obviously don't always use so much in OCD work, but like I think can be done, especially with compassion, can be very helpful. That compassionate self-talk. I like if you want to get someone's experience of it, this book, Jeffrey Bogle really charts his journey through it, and he's like a absolute expert on everything about it. And then this one has some ACT stuff in it as well, because people have been looking at ACT as a treatment method. You can recommend Unreal to people. There's a lot of good support there, and they're a lovely charity. I've done a session for their support group, and been to their sessions and things, and they're really nice, really good people. A lot of celebrities have this. There's some famous musicians and things who've spoken about it, and sometimes that's helpful to link people to. I think it certainly can be stress induced, and that's where if someone has that, we might want to pace the OCD treatment a bit more like you would for someone with autism or something like that, where you build in a lot of soothing, it's more gradual exposure. We might, allow more use of special interests and things to help ground them and things like that. So I think, yeah, with the first part of your question, I think it certainly can be switched on as a stress response. And actually, people get it in burnout. People without OCD will get this as a burnout symptom. So that's where, yeah, really taking care of the well-being lifestyle and slowing the pace down and getting those overwhelm skills good and good behavior in place before maybe moving back into more intensive ERP. The second one with the invalidating environments, yeah, I mean, I've seen it in domestic violence dynamics, things like that. It's like some people might get depression kicks in to make them submissive with the dangerous, with the dangerous partner, and that sort of protects them from, it keeps them submissive, so they're not going to be, like the chimpanzees will become submissive around a dominant other. And I think depersonalization can kick in like that, or just the stress of those kinds of relationships. So hopefully, yeah, and we haven't covered that so much because I guess I'm thinking skills and mechanisms and stuff particularly, but I probably did a very, very quick one statement on that with the FAP stuff at the end, that you could assess for that interpersonal stuff as you begin and be looking for those cues that there are some invalidating relationships or the trauma history or what's going on. And then obviously if it's current, we want to help them either move away if it's a very severe relationship, or try to change, their interpersonal relating. So you might branch off if you determine that is a big, we're always trying to work with the main difficulty, right? And the thing that's the main sort of issue. And if you found that that really was, then you could branch off onto that very quickly and be working interpersonally, working on assertiveness tools, or how do they get support and allies to move out of that dynamic, or working on, yeah, it depends, like it would depend on what type of invalidating environment, but you'd definitely want to validate that, be compassionate. Sometimes people can't move out of the invalidating environment, right, because they're either just their kids involved, or other, it's a work situation and they don't have that many options for another job or whatever it is. And then we might go heavy on self-compassion and, how do I be self-compassionate and work with this? So yeah, it really would depend on specific examples, but I think you're so right. You could be doing a lot of attachment work on, what is their history that's led them to be vulnerable to, bonding with people like that, or being susceptible to those sort of relationships. Often people are very kind, right, and very forgiving and understanding, then get paired up with these sort of invalidating, abusive partners. So helping them understand that and getting some of that protective, fierce compassion on board and things like that. So there's a lot you could be doing interpersonally. Sometimes, you have to get the fire down, obviously, before you work on the embers, to use Stu's metaphor, which may be Sam Greenblatt's, but Stu likes to use that one. I think sometimes, what we're doing to exacerbate the presentation might be the primary thing, and then you might be going on the interpersonal side of it. But sometimes, yeah, the interpersonal is the massive part of it. So you want to go straight for that. Um, and I think, different nervous systems. Yeah, some of us are, our nervous systems are more sensitive and we're more vulnerable to that. And I'm not sure we can always get rid of it either. So to some degree, getting a bit like OCD, recovery doesn't mean no symptoms. It's very true of this, of that with DPDR. People are often chasing, I want no symptoms. They can kind of remember a time before this when they didn't really have any of this, and they're harking back to that and they want that. And some of it is like bringing that compassionate message that you're always going to have some of this probably, but you can get better and better at coping with it and accepting it, so it's not a problem. Well, in a nutshell, I mean, I think obviously DID is a very, it's been this very controversial diagnosis that people are moving more towards being receptive to and seeing there are different degrees of it. I think, like, I haven't seen a lot of it. I've definitely had one person that had it, plus a lot of other stuff going on. She was in a really, really difficult place, didn't have OCD. And yeah, that those sorts of things I mean, they are protective, right? That it is a trauma response. It almost always, well, as far as I know, the research shows that it is almost always a response to very severe sexual abuse and things like that. But this, depersonalization, I think it very much can be there can be a version that is a trauma response, and it's a shutting down from the pain, and it can be numbing the grief and the sense of helplessness in the face of the trauma and the unfairness of the trauma. Yeah, it can really act as a avoidance of all of that. The problem is that in the early days, when it was first looked at, everyone thought it was only a trauma thing. So Elaine Hunter told me when she came into the field in this, her assumption, I think her dissertation was on the link to trauma, and everyone was thinking it was only trauma. And she found that actually there was a large proportion of people where it was not trauma at all. It's more like a trauma biology that could be switched on by stress or by hyper awareness or drug experiences or other things. So so I think it's like worth definitely assessing for trauma and being very aware of trauma, but not assuming that it is only a trauma-based thing. And actually, some people get really wound up if you talk about trauma. They're like, I haven't got any trauma. I've just got this annoying thing going on and I want it to go, and they'll present like that. So it's, yeah, us as clinicians a lot of us are very interested in trauma, will see that lens right away, but actually it isn't always. And then there's some research that shows it's like overactivation of the prefrontal cortex, shutting down the limbic system. So we obviously use the prefrontal cortex in CBT and mindfulness and things like that as a helpful tool, but it's like it goes over control and sort of shuts it down, is what some of the neurobiology says about it. It's good to be validating that actually it can sometimes feel like it's there all the time. I think it's there whenever they pay attention. I think you're right in the sense that there'll be times that people do forget about it and they're minimizing that. But you have to be very compassionate around this, because they'll often have been told by clinicians it can't be there all the time, but it's like it's there low grade all the time, and then it gets more intense, then it gets low grade again, and they might have periods where they forget about it very temporarily. But like hyper awareness OCD, you can have the sense that like I had days where it's like I'm aware of it. The morning I wake up, the minute I wake up to the whole day, I would say that, and it really genuinely feels like that. So I think, like that's one I think to be careful of a little bit, is that, if someone says it's there all the time, it means it's there at least most of the time. And it may not, it can be helpful to get them to go, well, how intense is it? And that could be the thought record, and like get them to really rate it on a scale and to see that actually it isn't at 10 the whole time, it is coming down a bit. But even mildly, it will really frustrate people and really upset them. But yeah, no, interesting stuff. I'm not an expert on DID, and it'd be great. I'd love to hear at some point, more about DID from someone who is, to be honest. I've heard a good CFT presentation on it, so we could possibly consider that at some point. But it's not, obviously it's not something you see. You more see people worrying about having DID, right? It's a mental health OCD topic when people think they have DID, when really they're noticing the different parts of themselves and the different emotional systems and things like that. And then they're starting to worry that they